just got done listening to a live online performance by one of my friends. And in music, just like in human conversation, moments need space to develop. A great performer like my buddy Michelle doesn't just play notes, they shape the time. And these musicians allow the music to breathe, creating meaning with phrasing and rubato and deliberate pauses. But not all pauses are created equal. There's a huge difference between intentional silence and dead space. Hi everybody, I'm Jeff Price, and I'm the host of Intentional Musicianship, where we explore performance practice, storytelling, showmanship, and audience connection. So today we're talking about one of the most overlooked but powerful tools in performance, the art of the pause. And here are 3 actionable tips you can try immediately. The first one is to stop rushing. Own the moment, own your time. One of the biggest signs of musical maturity is knowing how to control time instead of being controlled by it. Too often, we musicians rush from top to bottom without shaping the phrases. But phrasing is like poetry. You wouldn't read a poem in one breath without natural pauses. So for younger folks, it's easy to focus on just pushing notes out, thinking I played the right rhythms, so I'm done. This music will connect. But music isn't like that. It's not about just hitting the right pitches at the right time. It's about expressing something. So imagine an actor reading a script in a monotone voice, very metronomically, versus one who lives in the words. Those best musicians do the same. They embrace their inner thespian and they tell a story. Now, over the course of the year, I've seen a few competitions and many recitals. And sometimes you might see some younger players that oftentimes treat their performance like an extension of their practice room. They're focused on this metronomic beat, and they treat it as law as opposed to a guide. But the most compelling performances, these musicians allow things to breathe. They allow phrasing to unfold. So when I go to competitions, I can see that that competitor plays with intention, lingering on phrases, letting a moment land. It immediately stands out because you can see and hear that they're telling a story. You got to think of these pauses like punctuation, a comma, a period, a breath. They all serve a purpose. Don't rush through them. The second tip I have is silence creates anticipation. So a well-placed silence is one of the most powerful dramatic tools a musician can use. The best performers understand that the audience leans in when they sense something is about to happen. Now, we've all watched a movie where the music suddenly builds and then at that appropriate time it suddenly stops. I mean, everybody in the room knows something big is about to happen. And that's what happens in great music. Silence isn't empty, it's an expectation of the next thing. So remember, don't be afraid to empty the space. Use it deliberately. It keeps people engaged and emotionally invested. And that gives me an example, a caesura. I sort of call that the breath that speaks. In music, a caesura often marked as some sort of pause or a fermata, a breath mark, those kind of things that you get to the phrase that maybe you just want to have something that sort of lingers a little bit. Maybe not long, maybe not super dramatic, maybe just a breath, but that time matters. A caesura in the music is a musical equivalent of the speaker pausing before delivering the punchline of a joke or before the moral of a story. It's the breath before something meaningful, a moment where both the performer and the audience can reset. So my final tip today is that transitions matter. Don't lose the audience between movements. So one of the big time wasters in performance happens between pieces, movements, or sections when musicians drift off into their own world as opposed to transitioning with intention, including their audience in their work. So because of this, too often the energy of the performance dies. And so we might have an awkward silence before the next movement starts, or maybe excessive time spent adjusting music or instruments or stands as the instrumentalist sort of catches their breath before the next section, or maybe the performer is just waiting too long before they go on to that next section. So when this happens, the audience sort of disengages and their minds start to drift. Now, the goal of this is trying to figure out what you need as a performer, but being mindful of what's happening within the room and being purposeful in those transitions so you can keep that audience locked in. And so I think of this, everything that happens on stage is in view and you're telling a story, and everything on that stage is part of the story. And so if you're watching a play and between scenes and the actors just stood there staring at each other, it would just sort of kind of feel off. And so with music, you have to sort of figure out how your transition, whatever it is, even if you're swabbing out an instrument, can be part of the experience and part of what's expected, as opposed to something that creates that nervous energy or that distance between you and your audience. And so you can just imagine a performer that let that silence drag between movements, or just, was sitting there flipping pages, fidgeting, shifting around, and maybe that effect on the audience. That energy can definitely drop. But that other performer, they kept a natural flow. They took just enough time, when something was maybe going askew in the hall and maybe they needed a little extra time, they just sort of looked at the audience and gave them a wink, like they knew what was happening and they were still in control, that something great was on the way. And so in that moment, that performance can continue to feel like a journey, not just a bunch of separate moments strung together. So own those moments between those sections, whether within a piece or between pieces, because those moments over time become just as important as the music itself. So in closing, pauses are part of the music, not just gaps between notes. I love saying own your time, use silence intentionally, keep those transitions engaging. And when you do that, your performance stops being just correct and becomes compelling. It's an amazing story. So the challenge I'd maybe ask for you to take into your practice room is to ask yourself, where can you add space in your music and how you create it? Try something new. Try to see what kind of difference that makes. Now, if you have any thoughts on using this poetic, deliberate pause, this kind of freedom with your time to shape your music, and want to share what's worked for you, I'd love to hear from each and every one of you. Please visit us at intentionalmusicianship.com. And I just want to let you all to know that I see the uptick in the numbers of people listening, and I really do appreciate you listening today. And I hope you join us for the next episode of Intentional Musicianship.